23 квітня працює медіа-центр Україна. Мене звати Світлана Чепуренко. І зараз у нас відбудеться презентація.
Good morning. Today is April 23rd, and today we will have the research in Russian propaganda in the French media landscape, and it will be presented by Dmytro Korniienko, founder of the Resurgam information and analytical community, political scientist. Mr. Dmytro, I know that this is your second research. The first was covered in Spanish media. Today it's France. So for what I understand, you decided to focus on the countries that are stable partners of Ukraine, on whose aid we depend, and it's important for this aid not to be distorted by different information influences exercised by Russia. So if now France, let me ask you why France? Because it's geographically next to Spain. Well, in fact, really, we researched the partners of Ukraine now that the world sees that Ukraine can provide expertise, for example, security expertise in drones, but also we can provide expertise about Russian propaganda operated in their countries, because we're already through this phase and we are keep it through this phase. And given our close position to Kremlin, to Russia, I mean geographical, we can see how they can penetrate. In fact, the Russian propaganda frequently acts on the brink, and it's difficult to analyze it if you're not submerged in this media. It's just like down in a shahed. You have to develop the mechanisms, you have to train a little bit, and basically this research has a couple of goals, first of which is to identify how deep is that penetration, but also to cover the areas that contain some threats for our partners, the French, because that small seed of the hybrid war, where it is being sown, is the field of information. Then it's the political field, and as Gerasimov was writing, one of the apologists of the Russian political wars, so the following seat may be the military seat if their goals are not achieved using the two first ones. We were communicating with the French journalists. Sometimes we were misunderstood. They don't understand why do we research them. We don't research them to accuse them. There are no accusations. We just want to document things, because if we don't highlight the problems, they are only going to accumulate without being solved. So let's proceed to the research. Yes, straightforward. So here you can see the 8 media. Why 8? Because there were 10 in Spain, but French media write a lot more about Ukraine than the Spanish ones do. For example, in the Spanish ones, we've researched 1,900 articles across 10 media. Meanwhile, in France, we were able to analyze almost 4,000 across 8 media. But why this popularity is almost twice as much? Probably it's about the cooperation. Cooperation between Ukraine and France is more intense than we would like, for example, to have with even Spain. You know, the French press is interesting for us from our Ukrainian perspective. If in Spain we see certain ideological nature, you know, the French press is like sensible. When we were reading through a lot of articles, like he walked out and lighted up his cigar, something like that. That's a special type of press. So we were picking both leading and probably ideologically inclined, such as magazine Le Dimanche, and also the regional media, you know, to see the diversity of coverage. And the goal was to identify the key trends and potential threatening practices in coverage of war, which may influence the perception of the Ukrainian-Russian context by French audience. One of the questions we were asked, why don't you focus on the correspondents in Ukraine who write better. Yes, they understand the context because they stay in Ukraine, but what's important for us to find out is what they say in France about Ukraine. And in our opinion, we have a moral right to analyze the materials written about Ukraine. We don't analyze the way the French write about someone else. So it was important to share our expertise with the French because there are a lot of nuances that Ukraine is already through. There was already an expert discussion, and it's important for the process to be more streamlined in other countries so that they initiate discussions on certain matters. Methodology is still the same as with Spanish case. We already had a foundation. We don't demonstrate it. You can see it in our Spain presentation. The articles are being added by the volunteers. That's not a grant research. That's not a state research. We were acting as a community. We have a volunteer base in France. We were asking them what would be interesting for them to analyze because they would be helping with this analysis. So cross-evaluation is when all of the articles where Ukraine was mentioned in 2024 are added to one place, and then different people evaluated by number of criteria. There are 3 levels, like green is everything's good, yellow everything is good, but there is more of a cultural perception specific. So green and yellow are fine, and red is manipulation, Russian propaganda, misinformation, publication of unverified sources, lies, etc. Then there was an expert level of evaluation inside of our team. We were gathering the politologists, those who work with propaganda, and we were evaluating on top of the first grading to understand the results. And there is a detailized folder. By the way, it's twice as small as the previous one, and it's good. There was also a part when we were inviting independent experts from academic journalism, from the organizations working with propaganda, and so on. Also, we were inviting the representatives of French embassy. Unfortunately, they did not attend, but just like in case of Spain, first we would like to communicate the ideas so that they can express their opinion during any cultural activities. Well, probably due to some cultural differences, we could commit some mistakes, but let's proceed to the results. So there are 8 French outlets. We've analyzed 3,893 articles, and we see that quite a small percentage ended up in the red zone, only 99 articles. In fact, it's even less, so we're seeing that the French press, at least those outlets that we were analyzing, they're mostly covering the events in Ukraine in a correct way. They understand the context correctly. However, in 99 articles, there are no mentioning of authors or their press releases or editorial articles. We also came across such a problem in German media. Unfortunately, that's a common problem, but again, when the agency information is pulled based on the press releases by Russia, we consider it spreading propaganda without providing information by Ukrainian party. For example, the governor of some region in Russia says that the market was attacked by the Ukrainian armed forces without any verification. But then, 2 days after, it was verified that there were military targets, but still the French, for example, were accusing Ukrainians of attacking civilian targets. Now let's compare it with Spain by the number of articles. That's our research data in 2024. You see the number of articles analyzed has grown from 1,921 up to 3,893. So in red are the manipulative articles. In France, this level is way lower than in Spain. Meanwhile, the coverage of Ukraine is way more extensive. And the problems we wanted to focus on, first of all, is neutrality as the method of legitimization of Russian narratives, because we understand there are journalism standards of coverage of the parties, but in the international law, there is a clear definition of who's the aggressor and who's the victim of aggression, and equalizing aggressor and the victims. There is a plethora of articles like why wouldn't Ukraine make a peace with Russia? And the problem is that making a peace is not up to Ukraine. I mean, it's not up to Ukraine whether we stop the hostilities or not. And behind those articles, sometimes there are experts who back in 2025 ended up under the EU sanctions for propaganda, but most frequently, they represent such categories. Let's take a rational look. And neutrality, again, we should clearly understand the internationally established framework. There are limits to neutrality when it comes to coverage of sensitive issues, the sensitive issues of invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and the use of predominantly Russian sources. If we go back to the previous research, out of 99 manipulative articles, 57 have no mention of authors, their press releases or editorial articles, and we understand it's a banal press release that was reprinted, but they are based on the Russian sources, and this is what we mean by that. There are quite surprising cases, quite surprising press releases. For example, Putin's congratulations with capture of some Ukrainian city is quite surprising by its nature. Like, we copy the aggressor congratulating his troops with the occupation of some city. I mean, what's hidden there? I mean, we cannot say that is the fault of French media. They just translate the words of Russian propaganda, but still you have provided the context and the comments if we talk about such things as war, occupation, and death. Another problem is the lifting of responsibility. In Spanish media, we were coming across the same problem. For example, there were interviews where quite peculiar guests were invited who were covered in the media for their ties with Russians and providing them with a platform for Russian propaganda. For example, in French media, there was a number of interviews with Jacques Bot. I think it's a Swiss colonel who was sanctioned by EU in 2025, but until 2024, there were a lot of researches in French media about his ties with Russia, his direct ties with Russian agents. So it was quite a surprising thing. His interview was published in Le Monde. So what is the goal of such interviews where people just say out loud all of the narratives of Russian propaganda? And another one, interview with Owen Matthews, who is not yet sanctioned. He's a person who is famous for his ties with Russian elite. He's been living 20 years in Russia, and all of his addresses are the reiteration of Russian narratives. So I, as a reader, I put myself in the shoes of the reader. And if I trust an outlet, I'm not going to verify the information that is being printed there. That's one of the questions that we were discussing with our colleagues with our Spanish and French colleagues. Like, they were saying that the reader can verify the information, but we don't think that it works like this. We think that interview as the method of legitimization of Russian propaganda is one of the ways Russian propaganda arrives at Europe and Ukraine. Because if, for example, some editorial is sanctioned, like Russia Today or Sputnik, but even the representatives of Russia Today, I will cover it a little bit later, but again, they are already sanctioned, and it's easier in that case to work through some specific people, like it's his personal or their personal thought, personal opinion, and stuff like that. The topic of Ukraine as an element of internal political struggle in France very frequently it's being discussed as some influence on local authorities or opposition. We understand there is French political environment, French context, but very frequently Ukraine becomes a speculative topic, and conditional saying if the president of France supports Ukraine, then all of his initiatives are being criticized through the prism of Ukraine. Unfortunately, we were coming across such cases where just untrue information was being covered. There was an article where we were unable to verify such information, where 300 Ukrainian or like foreign military killed in Ukraine by one strike, and there was an argument in a discussion of the coalition about the coalition of the willing. So they were just making up arguments without verification of information and creating distorted image of events unfolding in Ukraine. Number 5 is reprinting of Russian media sanctioned in EU. Very frequently information from Russia Today and Sputnik is being used. Let me remind you that those are the sources of information that are sanctioned by EU. And those are not only EU, but also sanctions of France itself. But when it comes to editors-in-chief, there is such a person as Ksenia Efremova, and currently we monitor the events for the time being. So Ksenia Fedorova has 5 interviews in France on different topics. In her last interview, she was quoting Medvedchuk as a source of information. Maybe for the French colleagues, Medvedchuk is a person in Ukraine who was convicted of high treason, a person who was building the information network for overthrowing the authorities in Ukraine and capturing the power. There are also investigations about Medvedchuk, about his intentions to buy European outlets, to exercise Russian influence in Europe. So Ksenia Fedorova, she's the editor-in-chief of Russia Today, a person who parallelly builds a network and information holding in France. Well, most likely it's a hypothesis to replace blocked Russia Today France. Also, Alisher Usmanov, a Russian oligarch. Why did we emphasize him? Because this is what was happening in Spain. We study a couple of countries, and it allows us to see the peaks of information campaigns and their similarity. For example, in 80% of the cases, those who ended in the red zone, others they ended up during the same period that those in Spain. There are articles covering Alisher Usmanov. There are researches by different other outlets. The information campaign supporting Usmanov to lift sanctions from him, a person who is involved in Russian military industry, and there are interviews in Spain and France. They are the elements of the same campaign. And during those interviews, he was saying that he is in no way related to Russian war. So it's just interesting why such interviews, why are they taken? We understand Usmanov's meaning in sports, for example, and the way it all works. But if a person is sanctioned, at least in the article, it's mentioned that it's sanctioned, so those articles should clearly mark the meaning of this or that person. The problem of press releases: when one and the same article is being used out of those 99 in the red zone, we can sift at least those, because those are the same articles which ended up in the different outlets. We see that on the 1st of January, there is a press release issued that Ukraine shells Belgorod, and Ukraine is guilty of many problems, based on the statement by the governor of Belgorod region. And this statement is being reprinted without provision of context, without Ukrainian comments, for example, without verification, or at least mention of context by the addition. And given the fact that it's a press release, we don't see the author, we see only the agency, and is being disseminated on a massive scale. So that's the problem of press releases. It's difficult to call it an article. It's just a printed press release by Russians. So those are the results of our analysis by the editorials. As I've mentioned, green and yellow zones are quite all right. The only thing that raises questions is the red zone. And as we see, in the zone of statistic error are the problems in the red zone. Also, the basic evaluation was done by the system. It's automatic, it's not AI based, but it still can summarize the rating by the people, and they come up with the final rating. Our editorial rating was such that we could either add or retract 1 point, and as we see, the majority of French editorials have high level of verification of information and high quality of articles. In fact, Le Provence and La Libération have problems with the press releases, but that's basically the only problem to pay attention to. But otherwise, those are real quality results. Everything above 5 is considered more or less quality, and the only problem is Le Journal du Dimanche. There is a clear ideological inclination. There is the number of authors out of all of the editorials, which comprise almost 200 authors. There are only 8 that really raise concerns. So it's the problems with the interviews. It was mostly related to this editorial when we mentioned the interviews. And for example, when it comes to more ideologically inclined editorials, the problems that we would be able to identify would probably be the same. The classic media, they exercise their own function, and this media is also classic, but with a little bit of penchant, so to say. And basically, we were developing the proposals for French media. What in our important is necessary to start the discussion about? We suggested this discussion to the French media. Reject the use of the press releases about Russian invasion of Ukraine because of the sensitivity of the matter and necessity of quality verification of information with provision of context and detailization of events. There is such a tactic as a strategy of the first call. And any time when Kremlin uses weapons against the civilians, they try to comment it the first, so that the media picks up the first press release. Is the problem of our government communication as well, that we sometimes may communicate things very slowly, provide commentaries in a slow manner, but again, it's a sensitive thing. It's a sensitive and delicate matter when it comes to the war, and without verification of information, publishing any statements, for example, the statements dated in 2024 that Ukraine is involved in the act of terrorism in Crocus Hall. All of the French media reprinted that press release based on the Russian press release. Then they had to debunk it. They did debunk it, but again, that debunkment didn't work. Now there is an imagination or an impression that the Ukrainians are hiring terrorists to kill Russians. So it's not, again, an article is just a reprinting of Russian press release, but we're talking about the rate of penetration of the articles. Second one, to mark journalist materials received from French correspondents in territory of Russian Federation as such as prepared in the conditions of the legislative and censure restrictions of Russian Federation. For better understanding, if some may not know, in Russia there are legal restrictions. You cannot call war a war. You can be convicted of 5 to 10 years, and that applies to the foreign journalists who work there as well. For us, this staying of French journalists in Russia is a sensitive issue, but again, it's up to the French editorials. But still, the materials received from received by French journalists from the territory of Russia need to be marked as it's done, for example, by Reuters, because those are the materials received and written with the account of the legal restrictions. That's why the readers may get familiarized with those materials, but they need to understand that they have to verify the information by themselves to create their own impression of what's written in those materials, because there were materials, for example, about French journalists were meeting the operators of Russian UAVs. Those who were interviewed turned out that he was a Russian French. Then in the course of interview, it turned out that he was even a French Ukrainian, that he's fond of French literature, and then it turned out in the course of interview that he was for Maidan in Ukraine, but then he got disappointed and decided to fight against Ukraine. And obviously it's impossible to verify such information. If a person was involved somehow, then they need to verify. Well, I understand that's a strategy of the Russian special services. If there is a foreign journalist coming to create some legend, some information, so that it can be easily perceived by the French reader, then information received from the territory of Russian Federation included interviews and statements of the Russian officials should be marked as such that requires additional verification and may contain propaganda distortions. So in this case, we're talking about statements and interviews. For example, previously we were saying about Crocus, let it be published, but with a remark that this statement may not be true because it was received from the territory of a country with authoritarian political rule, and a person in Russia, they always give comments under some legislative pressure. Ukraine is through this discussion. Russian sources are not even perceived as information sources because of the risk of misinformation, and our friends from France and other countries of Europe should also consider that any person giving any comment in Russia, they give it with understanding that they are under pressure of 5 articles of legislation that restrict them for a pretty long term, with the confiscation of property for miscrediting of the so-called special military operation, not to use unverified Russian sources without additional verification. For example, the statements by Konashenkov in 2024, he was still quoted. He was a person who actually destroyed more Ukrainian material than there is military material existing in Europe. So it's a definitely compromised source, and refer him even in press releases is quite a peculiar practice. But again, even if you refer him, it's a matter of journalistic balance. At least refer any other independent source, but don't leave the comments of Russian officials like one-on-one with the reader. And also arrange the editorial policies with the sanction policies of the EU. For example, avoid quoting sanctioned Russian media and related persons. So the sanctions are imposed for a reason, and if you don't describe a person as those connected somehow to Russia Today, which is sanctioned, again, you omit a lot of information. And again, taking information from those editorials which are under EU sanctions, again, is not the right thing to do. Those are the 5 articles that we would like to appeal to. We don't focus on the people now because they're not so numerous, but one way or another we are going to print it on our website. You will be able to get familiarized with it. We just covered the general problems, but basically I'm ready to answer any questions if there are any. Thank you, Mr. Dmytro. Dear guests, dear journalists, if you have any questions to our speaker, if so, please raise your hands. We'll pass the microphone to you. Do you have any questions? Just a second. The speaker will use the translating device.
Hi, Scott Jacobson, reporter, Canada. So I've been in Ukraine for about 3 months now, and I'm coming from, obviously, Anglosphere media, independent though. With regards to the replication of Russian press releases, essentially, as sort of the main problem characters into French media, how are you seeing this replicated in the Anglosphere within some of the Western media as well? Is this a similar problem?
Thank you.
Yes, exactly. Absolutely. Why do we highlight this problem? Because it's a problem in Spain. It was a problem that we've documented in France. It was documented in Great Britain, Germany, but we haven't just published that data publicly. It's a systemic problem. We understand that there is like editorial task. You need to fill the news stream, but it's a systemic problem in many editorials and unfortunately in many countries. Thank you. Any more questions on the floor? Well, then let me ask the question. Those 2.5% that ended up in the red zone in your research, in my opinion, it's more about the negligence of the editorial or maybe some specific journalism. It's about verification of information, pluralism, political inclination. You know, it's more of something that is being like omitted and it somehow seeps through the media. Did you look beyond those 8 media? What's going on in those like smaller media, among local YouTube channels, local bloggers? Because there is an impression that if in this case, in the case of the big media, it's about negligence, but some explicitly pro-Russian platforms are been created and they exist. Yes, they're being created and they exist. And as we were studying the articles, we were trying to look deeper after we identify, after we study the article, we study the background of the journalism and of specific journalists, because it's about analytics. You know, it's a study based on the methodology. So I can tell you my personal opinion that yes, in the regional media, this problem is represented on the broader scale, in the social media, in internet, yet even on a broader scale, and it requires yet additional study. But our initial hypothesis was to study classical media, because if there is a problem, some significant problem in classic media, we understand that on the lower level the problem would be even bigger. So those 2.5% are really about failure to understand the sensitivity of the topic. The majority of those who ended up in the red zone, basically 57 are like press releases. They were only just to fill the strip. It's the failure to understand the sensitivity of the matter. But again, we were doing it for Ukrainians. Again, we were frequently addressed, like, how can you comment on this or that information in the foreign source? And very frequently, those foreign sources were committing like significant errors, starting from the errors in the names of some towns all the way down to the context. So those media who cover information about Ukraine, sometimes they frequently distort information when the comments are being provided. You know, we can see it as a cultural gap, but probably it may as well be a fulfillment of some editorial framework. But again, for the exhausted society, as Ukrainian, we need the article to be processed when it covers some sensitive context, and it's better to avoid any statements rather than providing some distorted statements. And then our French friends or our Spanish friends, they get information like, I've read somewhere that something happens somewhere else. So if we compare France to Spain, like on this slide, the difference in the number of manipulative articles is immense. So what are the regional specifics in those manipulative articles that you were able to study in these two countries? Well, unfortunately or fortunately, the editorials have different inclination. If that's an opposition editorial and opposition supports Ukraine, then the framework moves towards Ukraine. Then the similarity in spreading information. I mean, they mobilized the information that ended up in the red zone, and it ended up there through press releases, and they are active when there are sanctions being imposed. Talking about 2024, those were the fights about around Avdiivka and Pokrovsk, mostly Pokrovsk. The topics of imposition of a sanction package, rejection of Russian energy resources, and very frequently, specifically in op-ed, and we were asked, like, why do you even analyze op-ed if it's a personal opinion? And when we were asking the editorials about the op-eds, they were saying, like, we may reject the authors that we understand the source is compromised, but again, if there are lies published based on the Russian misinformation, for example, there were articles, you know, when journalists says they know what language do they use in the Ukrainian National Security and Defense Council. I don't know, they may have reliable sources, but there is a lot of made up things, a lot of information seeping to the media through opinions. Opinions are a method of legalization of information, because if they are published in a leading media, you know, the smaller regional media reprint those opinions without reference that it's an opinion, but rather with a reference to an editorial who enjoys certain reputation. If it's Le Figaro who writes it, obviously they see it in a different way. So it's not even about the negligence, it's about failure to understand the sophisticated matters, and through this failure, Russian propaganda penetrates the media space. And you know, if 2.5% may seem very little, at some moment they may significantly grow. Russian propaganda uses democracy, its weak points, because they say it's an alternative opinion, but in fact the boundary between alternative thought and spreading of narratives is not so thin. We can just build a barrier, a firewall, by processing the information from sensitive regions in a more responsible manner. Ukraine is a sensitive region now that the war is raging on. Do we have any more questions on the floor? Well, you covered it a little bit, but I would like also to get more details. If you had any communication with the French journalists, so are they ready to respond? And how do they treat the fact of their studying of their media space by the Ukrainians? We're not talking about the whole media space, but some number of editorials. So how do they react? Well, it's a different experience, both negative and positive. Those who understand the difference between analytics and research, they take it positively. We may argue about methodology, but there are moments when they start asking, why do you Ukrainians start teaching us how to write? Again, we don't teach anybody. We just try to defend what's ours, and we share the experience that you can understand and use. I wish none of you has that experience that Ukraine is getting now, but in case it's not you, some other country, we would accept it because you are ideologically inclined. But who can tell you about how to write about Ukraine other than Ukrainians? The Germans are hardly gonna study what the French media writes about Ukraine. Well, they probably would, but not from those positions that we. So we have both negative and positive experience of communication. There is a certain failure to understand the number of matters that I've described. Also, I removed the moral dilemmas from my presentation because we would spend way more time here. But there is like lack of understanding. Why do we have to do this? Why do you lecture us what to do? No, we don't lecture you. We just document things to understand with what countries we need to work in the media space, both for our own use, because we are interested in Russian propaganda not penetrating European media, but also for the sake of Europe, because we want Europe to be strong in the information front. Any more questions? If not, then let me ask you, how can we get familiarized with the full version of the research? In our website, Resurgam Hub, there is a section about researchers, there is one about Spain, and within probably a week we will add the research about France to the website, and shortly it will also be accompanied by a short article, because if I'm not mistaken, here is 252 pages, so we are going to just make it a little bit shorter. Let me remind you that we just had a study about Russian propaganda and French media, and Ukraine Media Center works on the schedule for the further days, so stay tuned. Thank you.